I grew up in South Jersey, so I'm just like from the Philadelphia area. Right. Yeah, but it's just easier to center. That's what I do. Yeah, unless someone then. That's what I do. Yeah, unless someone then. So yeah, then you're like, oh, this is hard. It's like really upper Camden, but no one wants to say that.
Oh yeah.
Well, they really kind of showed us probably here quite a bit. Like right by the aquarium, it's pretty decent now, but the rest of it's still pretty You gotta call me voice. That'll work for you.
Doesn't even look like a microphone.
It's a light.
Good evening. Welcome to the 19th University of Maryland School of Social Work Thursz lecture. After the midterms, strategies for progressives post-November 2018. I think I'm probably going to get you on my side if I say, isn't it great that the midterms are finally over? My God, it was forever before they came. We are honored by having Dr. Adolph, professor at the Ronald Perelman Center for Political Science and Economics at the University of Pennsylvania. More introduction is in your materials and will come from Thursz professor Michael Reich. I'm Rick Barth, for those of you who I don't know. Please let me know if you are new to the School of Social Work and this is your first visit here. So I'd love to welcome you, and I want to also welcome our students. How many students are here tonight? All right, fantastic. I see faculty, administrators, and staff. I'm delighted to welcome you to this additional conversation regarding social justice and our nation's future to better understand the implications of our recent elections. Today's discussion grows from our school's roots, which are in social justice and the work of Daniel Thursz, who is the second dean of the school, and his impact on the school and our deeply held values. Some of you know that Dan Thursz was a significant mentor to Senator Mikulski, and when he passed away, she decided to try to raise a chaired professorship for Dean Thursz, and with the able assistance of 886 donors, we created the Thursz Professorship. In social work, in some places, one person writes a check. In social work, it takes a village to raise a professorship, and it is a mosaic of many, many gifts, and we are duly honored to have Michael Reich as our first Thursz professor. I know that Dan Thursz would have been delighted to know about this kind of dialogue that involves addressing social concerns through the election process, and what we need to do to strengthen our society and create a more equal and just society. I want to just take a brief moment to acknowledge again Michael Reich and thank him for organizing today's events. He's been a great leader in our school, and one of the things he's taken on as the Thursz professor is to bring distinguished scholars talking about very current and pertinent topics. Some of those who he's invited, you'll recognize as remaining in the news. HHS Secretary Donna Shalala served as a Thursz lecturer, and now is the oldest freshman ever to enter into Congress. We've also been privileged to have, after the last election, when everyone was speechless, we had those who were not, DeRay McKesson, Kimberly Moffitt from UMBC, and E.J. Dion to do post-election analysis. And last year's Thursz lecturer, Lena Nguyen, is now the president of Planned Parenthood, which is another organization always in the news. And our final Thursz lecturer for the spring will be our very own Senator Barbara Mikulski, who still ranks as the longest-serving female representative in congressional history, and she'll be coming in the spring. So, without any further ado, please join me in welcoming our distinguished and tireless and brilliant Thursz professor, Michael.
Good afternoon. You all deserve a special medal for coming out in this weather. Thank you, and thank you, Dean Barth, for your gracious words. It's been my privilege. I may be tireless, but sometimes I get very tired. This is the 11th year of the lecture series, and as you can see from the back page of the program, we've had an impressive list of speakers from various disciplines and professional backgrounds. Some of them may be more familiar to you than others, but Google the others, they're all really very distinguished. What connects them all is their commitment to social justice and the work that they have done, not just the words that they've published, but the work they have done to achieve that worthy goal. Tonight's speaker, Dr. Adolph Jr., continues that tradition, and we're very pleased to have him here. As the program indicates, he's not only a distinguished and widely published scholar, he is, in the best sense of the word, a public intellectual. And he's also an activist on behalf of excluded and marginalized people. Through his numerous books and articles, and his essays in such publications as The Progressive, The Village Voice, and The Nation, he has reached a wider audience than most academics and disseminated his thoughtful ideas much more broadly than most university professors. His career and his accomplishments speak to the dual importance of publishing and disseminating quality scholarship. This dual role, I believe, is more critical than ever in the current era of alternative facts and the spread of widespread falsehoods on cable TV, AM radio, and through social media, particularly in the current political climate, which Dr. Reed is going to discuss tonight. Our advocacy in whatever field we practice for social justice requires that we focus as much on how, where, and to whom we communicate as we do on the focus and methodology of our research and scholarship. So whatever our political views, we recognize that the recent midterm elections signified a shift. How great a shift, we don't know yet, in the nation's political climate and the composition of its political class and electorate. Dr. Reed's lecture tonight will discuss the implications of the election results for the future and for efforts to pursue the elusive goal that we all share of promoting social justice in our society and the world. So I am very pleased to present our fall 2018 Thursz lecturer, Dr. Adolph Jr.
Is that here for now? Hi, thank you all very much for coming, and I want to thank everyone who's responsible for bringing me here. Quite happy to be here, but especially for all of you who are here, given that there are much better options than to brave this weather, and that applies even to those of you who've been trapped in the building all day, because you could at least have gone home. So I'm not sure if this counts exactly as an inspiration, but before I begin the talk tonight, something that Professor Rice said kind of prompts me to want to give to give a little bit, not much more than a paragraph of autobiographical statement, and I'll tell you why. Bless you. As you might guess from the looks of things and counting through the actuarial tables, I came out of the New Left and actually the Black Power movement in the late 1960s. And I went to graduate school in the early 1970s out of a sense of defeat. I've been doing different kinds of organizing in North Carolina principally, and I thought, okay, well, we've been outflanked and lost. So I spent most of the rest of that decade, doing one thing or another, trying to figure out how we got beaten and how maybe to try to do it better next time. And along the way, I was part, like a very small kind of neophyte part of a tendency that was most visibly identified with people like Francis Fox Piven, to try to develop a left critique of the welfare system or the social welfare state in the U.S. And then came Reagan, and pretty quickly thereafter we found ourselves having to shift gears, right, to defend whatever system of social protection, no matter what warts it had from this onslaught. And that meant politically making a judgment that I needed to, that it was necessary to crawl in bed with the liberal wing of the Democratic Party. And they did a couple of things that made it hard, tough in the early years. Certainly, Sabra and Shatila certainly stood out for me. But through most of the 80s, I would take my marching orders, go vote for Mondale, end up near Dukakis, but I'm proud to say I've never voted for Joe Lieberman for anything. The only vote that I've ever cast for a Republican was in a Senate race, when Lowell Weicker was actually to the left of Lieberman, and my son reminded me that the first vote that he ever cast was for a Republican in that same race. Anyway, and then come the late 80s, and up until that point, I was just basically like, pretty nondescript, assistant professor. I didn't have any kind of reputation for anything. But then come the late 80s, the idea of an urban underclass, which had been percolating since Ken Arletta did a 5-part series, I think in the New Yorker, was it, or Atlantic, or somewhere like that. That later became a book. And I read this stuff and thought, well, this is really warmed over culture of poverty ideology, warmed over sturdy beggar ideology. And then when William Jewis Wilson, I suppose I have to do like that, published a book that legitimized the underclass idea for liberals and social democrats, then like all bets were off, and that's ultimately, and I'm not holding Wilson responsible for this, but I say his work was like a punctuation point in a dynamic that culminated in the 1994 welfare reform, or 1996 welfare reform. And that's actually when I began to get a reputation for being combative, right? Because sometimes you just have to call bullshit by its right name, and especially if it's reactionary bullshit. And that's when I found it harder to follow around behind in the left wing of the Democratic Party, and fortuitously, it turned out, and this is where the autobiographical stuff is going to stop, I came across a fellow named Tony Mazzocchi, who was going around the country trying to build support for discussions about the idea of developing like an independent party of labor, based on the labor movement. And I've just looked back at the Democrats in kind of the same very, very instrumental way since then. So, all right, enough of that. But that does connect with the point, with the main point that I want to discuss tonight. First of all, about the midterms. You know, I'm not that kind of political scientist, so I actually, like most political scientists, work best at predicting what's already happened. I can give you like 20 reasons that it was inevitable that Woodrow Wilson won in 1912. But you know, I don't have that kind of crystal ball. Of course, I guess my colleagues who do pretend to have it don't really have it either, as elections have turned out, have shown up. But it's a mixed bag. Mainly positive, of course. I mean, like I assume everybody else in the room, am really bummed by the jealous race. I mean, I had the opportunity to work closely with him in the Sanders campaign. He's a great guy, and it just kind of underscores the Teflon that there is to Hogan, I guess. But while the outcome of the midterms is important, at the very least for stanching you know, the bleeding, right? That Trump's presidency and a Republican controlled both houses, and now the judiciary as well, opened up. What's really important, and I don't mean to downplay the significance of that at all, but that gives us a little bit of space, though, to reflect on, to engage directly in the debate about what Trumpism means for American politics and the left political strategy, and how we need to focus our efforts to build not just an opposition, but a credible alternative going forward. And to that extent, the talk I'm giving tonight is sparked most immediately by a reflection on the roiling debate within the academic left and the academic left dressed up as a political left that's taken shape since the 2016 election, because really the debate now is basically a continuation of the previous 2 years of debate about what Trump's victory means, what it says specifically for coalition building, possibility of alliances, and the kind of agenda that we need to try to organize around. The debate initially centered on how to interpret white working class support for Donald Trump, specifically whether we should understand white people's votes for Trump generically as indicative of their essential commitments to racism, patriarchy, homophobia, nativism, transphobia, or whether some of that vote should be understood as a consequence of democratic liberals' failure to address working people's concerns with economic insecurity. Because of the Democrats' commitments to the dynamics of neoliberalization that have actually intensified economic inequality nationally, and have undermined access to public goods and social supports for poor and working people generally. And this is not new. I mean, going back to the 2004 presidential election, my son, who had been living in central Illinois for 3 years, said to me, "Well, Dad, like it's simple about what's going to happen. Either Kerry goes into the Midwest and talks about NAFTA, or Bush is going to go into the Midwest and talk about gay marriage." And that's kind of what happened. But now the practical stakes of that argument have to do with what strategic lessons we as progressives, whatever we are, should draw from Trump's victory with eyes toward this past, or a couple weeks ago, and 2020 and beyond. Now, I think it makes sense to kind of parse the debate a bit, which in the interest of enhancing our discussion after my remarks. In early iterations of the debate, various anti-racist commentators and official Democratic operatives and a propaganda apparatus at MSNBC and elsewhere, theroot.com and elsewhere on the internet chattering left, have insisted that Trump's victory exposed the extent to which a deep vein of white Americans of all classes, except maybe the woke elements in the urbane professional managerial strata, are committed to white supremacy before and beyond all else. The strategic takeaway from that view is that those Trump voters, even the estimated just under 7 million to roughly 9 million, who had previously voted for Sanders and at least once, if not twice, for Obama, are hopeless reactionaries and can't be relied upon as potential allies, because their deepest commitments are to anti-egalitarian, or rather are anti-egalitarian, that their support for Trump reflected anxiety over perceived loss of status in relation to non-whites, women, and others. Now, this conviction has underwritten a contention that the lesson from Trump's victory is that it's not practical or moral, and the two are difficult to distinguish in this argument, to focus on increasing economic inequality and intensifying upward redistribution as the basis for left political appeals. And instead, that the necessary strategy should center on intensified mobilization of nominally oppressed non-white groups and women as a generic category on the basis of opposition to the disparate distribution of goods and bads in society among groups so identified, and in support of the principles of diversity as generally understood in the left of center political discourse. Now, I mean, it's kind of interesting actually, because there are several shorthand constructs in that argument. One is that, for instance, a tendency, and I assume others have not noticed this, but in this debate, like the working class has become the equivalent of a racial group, right? So the working class is white. When commentators, both journalists and chattering heads on TV, but also within the academy, talk about the working class, what they have in mind is a category that appears like 1950s comic strips. So I mean, that's a reference that probably only 5 people in the room could pick up on. But a big, beefy, white guy, phenotypically Irish or Polish, or in that bogus taxonomy, with the flannel shirt, hard hat, right? So you notice, for instance, that all of the centrist polls kind of break the distinction among white voters down to college educated versus not college educated, right? Well, a friend of mine just pointed out on the weekend that some recent study found that 42% of union members are college graduates or have at least attended some college. So that ought to do something to at a minimum raise some concern about that easy construct. And look, I mean, one of my colleagues actually, who's one of the kind of political scientists who construct the responses to surveys or to experiments as attitudes, wrote one of the seminal pieces on this claim and argued that white working class votes for Trump didn't have anything to do with economic insecurity, but were a response to perceived status threat. Like, I'm sure that most of you probably saw the moment of a discussion that rippled through popular culture about that article. And it's long. It's technically sophisticated, so forth and so on. But as with so much of technique-driven as contrasted to problem-driven work in the social sciences, I mean, this work comes up against or is hampered by the garbage in, garbage out problem, right? Like if your conceptual constructs and formulations of the universe that you're trying to parse is flawed by kind of dumb assumptions, then no matter how technically sophisticated the operations that you perform on the data set are, the garbage is going to be garbage. But I'm sure that's clear to everyone in the room. And more recently, three guys, I'm pretty sure they are guys, two in California, one at Brown, I think, applied the same kind of study to the 7 to 9 million people I mentioned before, who voted for Trump after having voted for Sanders and or Obama. And lo and behold, found the same thing that my colleague found, that didn't have anything to do with economic insecurity, that they were fundamentally impelled by commitment to white supremacy, right, in its various guises. So I read through this thing, and it was long. This was like 64 pages, most of which was about the techniques they employed and what they didn't employ. And I was curious about how they were going to explain the prior vote. I mean, not just for Stanford, but for the black guy, right? So I finally get to it, and the punchline was that they voted for Obama out of a sense of white racial guilt. So, can you imagine anything stupider? No. Yes, possible. I mean, I am a political scientist after all. And I have to say too that it's still weird for me to hear my affiliation with the Ronald O. Perelman Center for Political Science and Economics. Because we first of all just moved in the summer to this new building that I'd like to think of as an Ann Taylor Loft extension for play science, but because that's what used to be the anchor of the building. But what happened was, this is kind of telling too, that this rich guy was appalled to find that that political scientists and economists at Penn don't interact much. So he thought the way to correct that was to endow this building, and the main outcome of which I can see is that we've been confronted with a string of high-profile lectures by people like the custodian of Hayek's American Estate and his official biographer. So anyway, but that's all to say that you can tell there's a mystification in the way that the working class is constructed, right? So what happens is that black people, Latinos, women, transgender people all disappear as people who have to work for a living and exist only as representatives of this idealist taxonomy. Now, a question is, why does that happen? Well, the first response is habit. I mean, that's how people think, especially in the Democratic Party circles and in the Liberal Academy. But as the argument has progressed since 2016, an interesting kind of de facto alliance between ostensibly progressive proponents of identity politics, or as I have called them shorthand, identitarians, and Wall Street Democrats has come together around asserting, along with Paul Krugman and others, that horizontal inequality, that is, inequality between statistically defined racial and ethnic groups, is a more important problem than vertical inequality, which is characterized as inequality between individuals or households. And I'm sure we've all heard this argument as well. But that distinction, first of all, makes class and class inequality disappear, right? And it's a cardinal, or it's reflection of a cardinal stance of post-war interest group pluralism. that there are no classes, that there are only groups and isolated individuals. And moreover, in a sort of mission creep, opponents of what they decry as a class-first politics increasingly have come to denounce any expressions of concern for economic inequality as in effect catering to white supremacy. This tendency, which some colleagues have described as resting on a race reductionism, has surfaced and spread within the newly revitalized Democratic Socialists of America, DSA, as even many among those who consider themselves socialists object to the organization's choice of Medicare for All as its key political campaign on the ground that pursuit of decommodified health care for all is objectionable because doing so does not sufficiently center anti-racist and anti-disparitarian agendas. Now, I submit, just for the sake of argument, that there's clearly a problem when anti-socialism is defined as socialism. But the race reductionist argument is propelled by a combination of intense moral fervor and crude self-interest. And this year, I've argued in 3 different articles that as it has evolved, the post-2016 debate and now the post-2018 debate, if we aren't careful, has thrown into bold relief the class character of anti-racist and other expressions of identity politics. That could be a salutary product of the controversy in the sense that it's clarifying. It's good in this sort of debate for the mist of ideology to burn off and the material stakes involved to be clear and in the open. But many people who have followed or even participated in the debates have not connected the dots to see that obvious point or to acknowledge its implications. Now why? I mean, that's kind of an interesting conundrum for, especially for those of us who work in the history of ideologies. Well, one reason for the failure to see what seems to me to be the very clear class character of this politics is summed up pithily in Upton Sinclair's quip that it's difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends on him not understanding. Right? Not only would pursuit of an agenda focused on addressing horizontal inequality, if successful, disproportionately benefit upper status, already well-off people, as my friend and colleague Walter Ben Michaels and I have been pointing out tirelessly for more than a decade, that the reality of a standard of justice that reduces to opposition to group disparities is that a society could be considered just if 1% of the population controlled 90% of the resources, providing that the 1% featured blacks, Hispanics, women, lesbians, and gays, etc., in rough proportion to the representation in general population. But that would also mean, especially in this society in particular, and others like it, in which vertical inequality exists, or class inequality, is steadily intensifying along with the trajectory of upward redistribution. Larger and larger percentages of the total populations classified as each and all of those groups would get the short end of the stick. And also, advocacy of defining the only meaningful inequality as disparities between groups is itself a career trajectory in the academy. as well as in the corporate, nonprofit, and freelance commentary worlds. There's no point trying to communicate with those whose resistance stems from such material investment. No matter what they are of in the specific content, their responses to class critique always amount to, and like this is another reference that's going to show my age, but they always amount to Turkle the Orderly's lament to McMurphy in the film One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. This is my fucking job. Anyway. But purblindness to identitarianism's ever more clearly exposed class character also rests on naively habituated ideological thinking. Most of us operate with more or less vague or inchoate recognition that the past included bad old-timey times marked by openly racist practices like slavery and compulsory racial segregation, genocide against Native Americans, Chinese exclusion, imposed gender hierarchies, etc. But in lieu of examining the discrete sources of inequality in the present, an anti-racist ideology in particular depends on asserting superficial analogies to those earlier historical periods when racial exclusion and discrimination were more direct impediments to Black Americans and other non-white social position and well-being. Thus, for example, Michelle Alexander, as I know we all know, proposes that contemporary mass incarceration be understood as a new Jim Crow, though even she allows that the analogy doesn't really work. And expressions of outrage at miscarriages of justice in the present commonly allude to practices associated with slavery or the segregation era. I mean, as I've argued elsewhere, such assertions are not to be taken literally as empirical claims. They are rhetorical. No sane or at all not knowledgeable person can believe that Black Americans live under similarly constrained and perilous conditions as they did a century ago or longer, or I will attest a half century ago. That's one of the benefits of being old. Those analogies and allusions actually carry a silent preface. For instance, this incident, phenomenon, pattern makes it seem as though, close friends, nothing has changed. Yet the claim itself presumes that things have changed because the charge is essentially a denunciation of objectionable conditions or incidents in the present as atavistic and a call for others to regard them as such. Attempting to mobilize outrage about some action or expression through associating it with discredited or vilified views or practices is a common gambit in hortatory political rhetoric, more or less effective for a rally or a leaflet. But this anti-racist politics is ineffective and even destructive when it takes the place of scholarly interpretation or of the strategic and political analysis. And I'll try to make this concrete. I mean, I've drawn on in my work on political controversies in contemporary New Orleans in particular that I think provide an apt frame of reference for demonstrating anti-racism's limitations as a political critique and class character as a politics. For instance, anti-racist new political critique failed abysmally after Katrina to mobilize significant opposition to elimination of low-income public housing at the moment of the city's worst housing crisis, probably in the 20th century, or since sometime like in the 19th century. For instance, during that period in the 1830s, when 20 to 30,000 Irish immigrants died digging the New Basin Canal. But And the same was true for the efforts to mobilize opposition to the ongoing destruction of public schools in the city. That politics, which posits an abstract black community against an equally abstract racism, couldn't provide persuasive responses to the blend of underclass ideology that stigmatizes public housing as an incubator of a degraded population in the context in which black people participate as administrators, functionaries, contractors, and investors, all in the blessed name of racial representation in the commercial opportunities provided by privatization and the destruction of those institutions. The debate over displacement for upscaling redevelopment, including the proliferation of the Airbnb industry, is another case in point in that city, but also much more broadly. But I know it's a huge issue in DC, Boston, and elsewhere. In opting for a language of the gentrification, which I'm now in the warpath against, right? I mean, this is like an old man's rant, but I have a campaign going now against the use of the term gentrification. Opponents of displacement, often without necessarily intending to do so, cloud a simple, straightforward dynamic: public support of private developers' pursuit of rent-intensifying redevelopment, with cultural implications that shift critique away from the issue of using public authority to engineer upward redistribution and income, or rather of upward redistribution, and impose hardship on relatively vulnerable residents. Instead, the discussion of gentrification slides into objections about display of privilege, lack of recognition or a respect that, notwithstanding the moral outrage that accompanies them, accept the logic of rent-intensifying redevelopment as given, and demand only that newcomers acknowledge and honor Aboriginal habitus and practices, and that the community be involved in the process of upgrading. The same racial or cultural discourse has unhelpfully shaped opposition to charterization of public education by focusing on the racial dimension of the process. The fundamental problem with Teach for America, and I hope this can stop a bullet, but the fundamental problem with Teach for America and the corporate privatizers for whom TFA provides shock troops, after all, is not that the missionaries are mainly white and unfamiliar with the native culture, or even that many of them are tourists building extracurriculars for their graduate and professional school applications. Those are only idiosyncratically distasteful features of a particular line of attack on one front in a broader war on public goods, and on the idea of social solidarity that's in line with the marketization of all human needs. And that sort of culturalist discourse also opens opportunities for petty and not so petty entrepreneurship in the name of respect or recognition for the community, within the logic of neoliberalization. So race reductionism enables a sleight of hand in which benefits to individuals can appear to be victories for the generic racial population or community. The more deeply embedded a groupist notion of fairness or justice becomes as common sense, the more easily that sleight of hand works under labels like community empowerment, voice, opportunity, or new representation to propel and legitimate accumulation by dispossession. So this takes us back to Sinclair's dictum, which underlies the material truth of anti-racist politics and other expressions of identitarianism that are hostile to politics based on class solidarities. Yet, even the crudest self-interest depends on ideological mystification for its legitimacy. And racism, and the former term is not thinkable without the latter, has always worked in exactly that way. Only now, in the aftermath of the victories of the 1960s, it can work to the benefit as well as to the detriment of non-whites. The cornerstone of race ideology, which is not now and never has been incompatible with capitalism, is presumption of ontological level differences among human populations apportioned into racial groups. Just as 19th and early 20th century white supremacists insisted that fundamental differences preempt political alliances based on common material conditions, many anti-racists posit whites' trans-historical and thus primordial commitment to white supremacy toward that same end. That's the more insidious basis of the impulse to argue for the primacy of race in contemporary politics via allusion to the past. Like all forms of race reductionism, it masks a class-skewed agenda. That underlying reality helps make sense of both why anti-racists seem unconcerned that their exaltation of challenging disparities is the paramount, if not exclusive goal of egalitarian politics, is entirely consistent with neoliberalism's regime of intensifying economic inequality, and why their de facto alliance with corporate and Wall Street Democrats against the conventional left has been automatic and untroubled. So, given the extent to which I think that the struggle among progressives over how to think about class versus identity politics, to put it crudely, is going to be central as we go forward. I think I'll conclude with like laying out some postulates about how it makes sense to think about race and about black politics, or race and politics, but about black politics in particular. One, slavery was fundamentally a labor relation, not an extreme system of race relations. Now, this is one of the hardest things to get across to students that can be imagined now. And, to paraphrase Barbara and Karen Fields, slavery's objective was to produce cotton, sugar, tobacco, and rice, not white supremacy. Its appeal to the planter class was that it secured a labor force that had no rights or recourse, not that it was a permanent camp for sadists. And irony of the view that defines slavery as institutionalized brutality is its implication that slavery without extremes of brutality might not be objectionable. Two, the segregationist regime was an historically specific social order based on disfranchisement of the vast majority of blacks and a substantial percentage of whites, imposed by Southern elites after defeat of the largely interracial populist political insurgency in the late 19th century. It was defined by an extensive, legally codified system of racial subordination. That order was not fully consolidated until World War I, and its institutional foundations were crushed by the late 1960s. That is, it was a regime that prevailed for roughly 60 years, depending on your location, or as I sometimes say, point out to make it, to help undergraduates get it, like all four of my grandparents were fully sentient beings before the Jim Crow order was consolidated, and its back was broken a couple months after my 18th birthday. All right, three. There is no singular transhistorical black liberation struggle or black freedom movement, and there never has been. Black Americans have engaged in many different forms of political expression in many different domains around many different issues, both those considered racial and not. They have engaged in race solidaristic formations and in close concert with others in class-based and multi-class alliances. As my colleague Cedric Johnson has argued forcefully, contemporary scholarly discussion reads black politics. The ethnic pluralist group politics are articulated mainly since the 1960s, back anachronistically onto the varying and pragmatically grounded political expressions in which Black Americans have engaged since emancipation, which he describes as Black American political life. So the operative distinction is between Black American political life and this thing we call Black politics. The political differentiation has been as common among Black Americans as among all others. Moreover, matters bearing specifically on race or racial disparities have never exhausted or exclusively defined Black Americans' political concerns. 4. Only a couple more of these. As a corollary of 3, the issues driving the post-war Southern mass mobilization against segregation and the emergent black interest group urban politics in the North and West and the big city South were distinct. Lumping them together under a blanket construct like the long civil rights movement doesn't help us comprehend the discrete features of either, or more important, the distinct trajectories that each set in motion. 5. Black Power was not a mass radical insurgent movement. It was a militant expression of ethnic pluralism. Radicals of various sorts, including ideological race nationalists, or my son sometimes calls the costume party aspect of Black cultural nationalism, occupied the fringes of Black Power politics, but the driving and commanding forces were always the assertive elements within the new Black political and professional managerial class that emerged from opportunity structures opened in the victories of the civil rights movement, the dynamics of urban demographic transition, and incorporation into governing regimes, and of course, the war on poverty, model cities, and foundation-funded programs. Nominally radical groups such as the Black Panther Party, the League of Revolutionary Black Workers, and others with less cachet among the left, were not serious alternatives, certainly not the romantic roads tragically not taken of post-New Left fantasies. General Baker, long-time United Auto Workers activist and co-founder of both the Dodge Revolutionary Union movement, DRUM, and the League of Revolutionary Black Workers, was emphatically clear that those tendencies were entirely specific to Detroit and the centrality of the Union in local democratic politics. The BPP was founded in 1966, and by the end of the decade was already in disarray, especially outside Oakland, as a result of police repression, to be sure, but I mean also of their own political incoherence. Finally, and this is probably less pertinent here than it would be in a cultural studies program, but since that stuff tends to leach into everywhere, I'm going to lay it here too. Neither Malcolm X, Frantz Fanon, C.L.R. James, nor Stuart Hall can tell us anything strategically useful about the Black American political situation. Appeals to their putative wisdom stem from academic leftists' romantic attachments and commitments to race reductionist politics. Malcolm was dead before practically all the big events understood to define the 60s had occurred. Fanon died several years before Malcolm, and in any case, his focus was always elsewhere. He gave only the most general attention to the U.S. James's time in the United States, as I've argued, was on the political equivalent of a tourist visa. He was not enmeshed in the Black American politics and understood its internal and external dynamics in only an abstract, formalist way. The same pertains to Stuart Hall. Attachments to the likes of Malcolm, Fanon, James, and Hall are more totemic than intellectually or politically productive. There is a more pernicious aspect of embracing those figures, supposed authority. Each is read as propounding trans-contextual insights about race. And such insights are not necessarily both empty and the race reductions. And I think I've talked at you enough. Comments, questions, answers? Anyone? Yeah.
Expound on your thesis of anti-gentrification.
Oh, yeah, I mean, my objection is like just to the use of the term, right? I mean, and it's historically specific, right? It's in our passage, right? I mean, I suspect you remember when people first started talking about it in the late 70s and the early 80s. It initially understood as a political economic phenomenon, right? Of the rent intensification. And what happened over the 80s, probably more the 90s, and since, is that, and I think this is partly a function of how we incline to mobilize to fight the displacement, right? And it's complicated by the fact that that on our side, and including, if not especially, those people who are going to be the victims of it, don't even find out that projects are in the works until it's too late to do anything about them. So the most you can hope to do is try to win the best possible terms of surrender, right? And I've been involved in a number of those fights over the years. But what I noticed about the context of fights, and it was especially clear in a place like Chicago in the 90s, where there was like a centrally orchestrated plan, right, to sort of move poor people out of an area from like 4,000 north, right, to 6,700 south, and between the lake and the Van Ryn Expressway. And this meant, among other things, right, getting rid of public housing, and this is another setting in which technical fixes, right, which our side managed to present for them, like the new urbanism and the mixed income housing occupancy, were touted in exactly the same way that urban renewal was touted, like when I was a kid, to represent displacing poor people as the equivalent of an anti-poverty strategy, right? And I mean, the flim-flam of the representation, should have been obvious, like in the 50s, and some people it was. So what's happened though is that as activists have tried to mobilize to save the neighborhood or protest or get whatever they can, a campaign discourse of cultural right to a neighborhood, right, has come increasingly to dominate the discussion, right? And I mean and what happens then is that for the co-ethnics, right, a line is, and I've had this experience a lot too, just talking to random people, that yes, the displacement is really sad, but if you play your cards right, there are opportunities, right, and to get in on the game, and it's not venal, right? It's not that people have bad motives, it just speaks to the hegemony of neoliberal marketization, right? And in that sense, the way that, and pick a city, right? But the way that critiques of the gentrification are played out now, it's kind of like, well, my comrade brother Mark Dudley's phrase is a beautiful, it's a pageantry of protest, right? And after the pageantry, or after the pageant's over, right, like then the entrepreneurs come in and adopt the mantle of the representatives of the interests of the community. So and that's why, and look, I mean, all right, so it's a word. So if people want to continue to talk about, you know, gentrification, use the term, but make clear that what they're talking about is not destruction of an Aboriginal culture, but public support of an ongoing marketization process. Fine, maybe use gentrification. But I just call for a ban, partly to be dramatic, and partly because, you know, I'm old. And that's the kind of shit that old people do. But, yes?
What's your thought about strategies that progressives should use if we want to try and get back the White House in 2020?
Well, look, here's how I have hoped that things would go. Okay? That at the state level, you know, there are tensions, presumably, possibly, right? That can emerge between mainstream Democrats and left Democrats. Excuse me. You know, the Sanders-istas, right? And for 2018 in particular, it seems to me that the balance had to be shifted in the direction of electability, because it's crucial, right, to win one house, right, at least. And look, I mean, maybe I was prepped for this because Mike Madigan, the Speaker of the State House in Illinois, has always been pure hack. And when Ronald was elected, and I mean pure hack, and when Ronald was elected, I and everybody else who had any history in Illinois politics felt really awkward and fragile about the idea that Madigan was our bulwark against Ronald, right? But he has been, and for whatever his reasons, right? I'm not his confessor, right? I don't know. Well, and that may have softened me up to this, but you know what just happened there, and turned out to be a big victory for our side, was that our billionaire beat their billionaire, right? Right. I mean, for governor. So there's got to be stuff like that going on. But the thing that I'm concerned about, and look, I mean, I'm as supportive of Stacey Abrams' campaign as anybody. I think I gave Ben Jealous more money than I've ever given any politician anywhere. But I'm used to losing. But anyway. But what I'm concerned about is that I think that we'll do better, right? All right, so obviously on the spectrum that runs from the white working class, it is a racist race, to a perspective that was hatched in Moscow in like 1918 or 1919. I'm obviously a lot closer to that one than to the former one. I think as leftists that we have to be, because first of all, there's no such thing as race, and what that means is that there are no ontologically wired attitudes. There's no primordialism, and we're also aware of the fact, as Tony Mazzocchi said for decades, that the Democrats aren't offering working people anything, right? And if we can't find a way to do it, because the system's going to get more and more critical, more and more dangerous and unequal, and if our side can't find ways to offer both explanations of conditions and roadmaps out, then more dangerous forces will. And I mean, that's happened to some extent, right? I don't think it's possible to win back people, or it's cost effective to try to win back people who are ideologically committed, right? I mean, there was a time in the 90s when Alexander Coburn thought that we could, that our natural allies were in the militia movement, and we could win them back. But it's like, it's a conversion exercise, right? But I think we have to start out from an assumption that a significant percentage of those people who voted for Trump, and in particular of that 7 to 9 million people who voted for Trump after having voted for Sanders and Obama at least once, aren't totally motivated by committed white supremacy. It's and we don't need conversion, right? Right? We don't need to cleanse the hearts of the wicked, right? God, that felt Protestant to say that. I wash my mouth out. But this is the point I'm getting to. Among the issues that played best for the Democratic candidates was healthcare, both in Pennsylvania and elsewhere, because we get in Philly, we get Pennsylvania, Jersey, and Delaware commercials. Even the worst assholes who were most openly courting Trump claimed that they were committed to protecting pre-existing conditions, and they're all lying, of course. But even literal scum of the earth, who I was convinced would lose, Robert Menendez, who was like the third Menendez brother. Won, but he kept his seat, against a Trumpite pharmaceutical company owner or a CEO or whatever, who kept trying to present himself as protecting or as a pro-choice Republican who was committed to protecting pre-existing conditions. And all of Menendez's commercials just said Social Security, Medicare, they're going to come after it. And he won big, right? So the takeaway from that, as far as I'm concerned, is, and this is, like the message I'm going to be carping on forever or between now and 2020, that we have the potential to form a new coalition, form a new alliance with Medicare for all at the center of it, right? Because there's, look, I don't have the exact numbers, Mark I'm sure does, but not only large percentages of Democrats, but I think even a significant majority of the Republicans favor it. And if the purpose of politics is to unite the many to defeat the few, which is something I read in a pamphlet someplace in the 1970s, then it seems like a no-brainer. It's like winning any kind of election, like a union election, a school board election. What you want to do is find the issue that connects people broadly, right? And once they're connected as part of a common struggle, then that gives you a context, right, for trying to bevel away misconceptions that people have about one another at a group level. And I'll just say too, because I'll make one more point about the racism. And it drives me crazy, right, that people, two things. Well, among the things that drive me crazy, including the fact that the Boston Red Sox have now won 3 World Series. That ruined baseball completely. But one thing that drives me nuts is that a lot of people on the nominal left think that being part of our movement should be like pledging a frat, right? I mean, like, you gotta know all the code words, you gotta have the hand signs, and it's what I have a young cousin who's a junior at Wesleyan, and she's gotten politicized. And last time I saw her, she was talking to me about how important it is to call people out, right? So this call-out culture thing, it's counter-solidaristic, right? So it's an alternative to building a movement, and it's not a very good one. And that's another way that this kind of politics is totally compatible with neoliberalism. But the other thing about it is, and speaking partly, you know, as an historian of ideologies who partly studies race as an historicist ideology, racism is a bad thing, right? Whatever racism means. The way we talk about it now is often quite like how we talk about terrorism, right? It's not so much what people say, it's not so much what people actually do, but that it's considered like a miasma, right? That makes things happen in society. And ironically, as people present this rhetoric, thinking that it's a radical departure from liberalism, but that's actually the kernel of post-war racial liberalism, like in the U.S. I mean, how many people here have never heard the statement that racism is our national disease, or it's like a cancer, or I must say, yeah, some kind of sorry, I mean, how did I forget this? It's America's original sin, right? But it's not any of those things, right? I mean, it's not a thing, first of all, but people talk about it like it's a thing that has an independent will that makes shit happen in the world, right? And not only that, but it's the worst thing, right? But the reality is, like, you take examples like even what seem like extraordinarily obvious ones, right? Like the school desegregation fights in the 50s and 60s, and the open housing fights from the late 40s through the 60s. You can find as much of the most pornographic, old school, racist rhetoric as you want to find. But when people understand themselves to be the equivalent of a street fight, what you do is you pick up whatever's on the ground that can be useful to you, right? And that's to say that what people express in their worst moments, right, may not reflect how they feel, what they think of, whom they associate with in other moments, right? So, I mean, it's and part of the interpretive problem. Peter Novick, like in a great book called The Holocaust in American Life, a couple of decades ago, said that the notion that it's in times of crisis when you can tell what people are really made of is bogus, and also stacks the deck to find the worst in people, right? Because the reality is, like in moments of crisis, most people will try to, do something like, try to protect themselves, right? But to do something like just sit quietly and hope that whatever it is passes them by, doesn't get them, right? Right, like as a kid. When you think there might be a monster in the closet, you just kind of pull the covers up over your head and hope it will go next door and eat your brother. So where I think the focus ought to be, and granted, things are more complicated now because the genie's out of the bottle, and they're going to be firsts of whatever sort, right? Like electoral firsts that spark enthusiasm among people, right? And that's just something we have to deal with pragmatically. But I think if I felt better about the capacities of our side, I would, or if I had more of an ultra-left tendency, I would say that that Trumpism has now drawn a line in the dirt that should make it easier for us, to try to build the kind of alliance that we need to have to win. But part of doing that is how we try to resolve some of these issues within our own ranks. I don't know if that's adequate. Okay, thanks. It felt a little bit like you asked me what time it was, and I told you I would make a watch. Yes.
I just had a couple of thoughts that I'm going to try to formulate into a coherent question. Hopefully it works. I think the other day the FBI noted that hate crimes are up. I believe it was around 17%. Related to that, the fourth branch of the government, the media or press, Sinclair Broadcasting up in Hunt Valley has, I think, overwhelming majority of local news outlets.
Right.
I was flipping through my channels the other day and didn't realize how many other channels that are there beyond the mainstream ones that we know of, obviously Fox News, what have you. And within a matter of weeks, a narrative was created that a group of migrants traveling north were murderers, terrorists, and people like a portion of the population truly believe these things.
Right.
Meanwhile, they're saying the Senate is going to become harder and harder for Democrats to gain a majority, while the House might be easier as we do better in the suburbs and urban areas. Obviously, the Senate confirms judges, and with the rules change, no longer needing 60 votes.
Please bring your question.
I'm sorry, the courts have been packed, so a lot of the checks that had been in place protecting historic institutional racism or biases have eroded via the media, and then how do you feel about that? I just can't imagine that it's all not going to collide once the economy crashes and it uses a strategy of fear to blame others.
Yeah, well, no.
Sorry for the long way.
Yeah, no, I get the point. I mean, yeah, look, like we're kind of in a race against time here, right? And I mean, I know it may feel like a different kind of scapegoating, but I blame the Democrats for all this stuff, right? I mean, and the Democratic Party, since either Bill Clinton went into the White House, or since I went in the party and created the DLC in 1985. Because since then, the mainstream of the Democratic Party has basically striven to be the Republicans' light, right? Or the Me Too, but not so much party. But all right, so I mean that's easy. That makes me feel better, but that doesn't address the problem. First of all, the thing about the Senate is that it wasn't that long ago when the argument went exactly the opposite way, right? Right, and that the Republicans could do better in the House than they could in the Senate. And I know, so, right, I mean, that depends, right? I mean, that depends on what we do on the ground. Like those Democrats who won governor's races in states where they replaced Republicans are a sign that it's possible to do something statewide. And in some ways, there's nothing like having had one of these right-wing governors for a term or two to make it easier for the Democrats to win. Bobby Jindal, Brownback, right? They fucked the state up so much, right, that people could finally see the problem. The judiciary thing is obviously a real issue, and I was just joking a few days ago that I've sort of gone back to reread stuff about the Lochner era, because that's kind of what's facing us. And this is a little bit like, you know, trying to make lemonade out of poison lemons. But what's been the principal line that the Clintonite Democrats have been using to avoid having the debate about the direction of the Democratic Party that a lot of us have wanted to have? And the reason, just to hold your nose to vote for any Democratic presidential candidate, no matter how repugnant. It's been the courts, right? The courts. Well, I mean, they got to come a little better than that now, because the other side has won the courts, and it poses it poses other strategic challenges for us that I mean, I don't know what to say about it at this point. I guess we'll have to figure it out as we go along. Yes.
You mentioned early in your lecture about just kind of there being a difference between educated and non-educated voters based on what they vote for. Do you have any strategies that you would suggest for helping to narrow that gap or bridge that gap so that it's not just one side voting that's educated versus the other side is, you know, that's obviously not, that's a stereotype,
Right.
but that's the general narrative that we hear about. So what would you suggest for addressing something like that?
Well, no, the thing I would suggest would be to forget about the levels of educational attainment as a key fault line. I mean, there are other ways to think about the working class, for instance. The Michael Zweig, in a great book called The Working Class Majority of America's Best Kept Secret, argued from a couple of different directions that between 55 and 60, and probably now 60+% of the population, when given the option of identifying themselves as working class or a middle class, will choose working class. And his sort of objective qualification has to do with largely with the degree of supervisory responsibility that you have in the job you work. Right. I often think that the greatest long-term, the most insidious consequence of the Taft-Hartley Amendment in 1947 was setting up this bogus, distinction between white-collar workers and so-called white-collar workers and so-called blue-collar workers, which has only encouraged the propagation of this ridiculous category of middle class, right? I mean, if that's one of the clearest confirmations, or I guess affirmations of the class character of American social science, that people work with this notion that includes somebody who makes $50,000 a year and may own like a little house in Sparrows Point versus somebody who makes $500,000 a year, and they're all kind of lumped in together. Homeowner populism, right? That also grew, over the post-war decades, has also encouraged a kind of fashioning of a notion of shared interest between all kinds of people who own houses, right? Which hasn't helped us. So in that sense, I go back to the same thing. The thing is to make actual connections with actual people and try to build around something concrete, like Medicare for All. And I'll say this too. I mean, the Democrats have their version of this bogus constituency that they've called up like every 4 years since at least Gore, right? And that's the moderate Republican, upper middle class, suburban white women. Yeah, and it never existed, right? They maybe got a bump from that in 92, the so-called Year of the Woman, because of the Clarence Thomas era, and they maybe got a bump from that now a little bit. I don't know, but in 2016, the Clinton campaign, like in Eastern Pennsylvania anyway, just ran these two ads over and over and over 20 times a day. One was a woman who was actually an econ professor at the Drew University of New Jersey, but gives off all the markers of a mainline probing, right? Saying, I'm a Republican, but my son has autism, and there's no room for my son in Donald Trump's world. And the other, what was a grab him by the pussy ad, right? And I watched those, because it's clear whom they were targeting. And I kept thinking, really, you really think this is going to win Pennsylvania for you? Really? But I think the fact that they keep doing it, right, says to me they're not stupid. I mean, they're as smart as we are, and they are more committed to winning, right? I think than we are. I think it says something about.
I'm sorry, but you mean conservative?
No, the Democrats.
Oh,
Yeah. But the thing is that they want this constituency to be there because it fits with the interpretation that they make ideologically and programmatically. Yes, Michael?
I have a strategy question.
Okay.
I agree with you completely about the need to form these kind of cross-cutting, interracial, class-based coalitions. In the past, the vehicles to do that were unions, grassroots rather than presidentially oriented Democratic Party, and at least the early stages of some components of the civil rights movement.
Right.
In various ways, all of those institutional structures have been severely attenuated, if not eliminated. What do you see as the vehicles for getting out the message that you would like to see conveyed to create and sustain these kind of coalitions, both electorally and in terms of advocacy for policy change at the state and national level?
Oh, so I guess you picked me up at the train station to put me on the spot and embarrass me.
I sat there in the rain for a while. You owe me this one.
Payback is a bitch. But no, look, I mean, that's real, obviously. And part of the answer, and this may stem from my relative lack of imagination, is we have to rebuild those structures, right? And especially the labor movement, right? And some people argue this kind of work can actually be part of the rebuilding the labor movement. But the struggle is going to be an internal one and an external one. And I think that nobody's more familiar with that than Brother Dudley here. Some of the others kind of problematic, right? Yeah, I mean, there are still good people in local democratic organizations, right? And in some places, like our revolution has potential. From what I understand, it's been pretty effective here. I'm here in Maryland as being, I mean, that kind of structure. The problem with the civil rights movement is that the way that people understand what the civil rights movement was and how it happened kind of gets in the way of trying to use or trying to rebuild that kind of structure. And so much, and I mean, the problem, like the notion of, how does one get to be a black leader? Well, now the way that one gets to be a black leader is have commentary on MSNBC, right? So much of that activity is displaced to empty position taking, right? Even Black Lives Matter. I mean, the Chicago mayoral race was an interesting test case for this. That this Black Lives Matter activism around the city. I mean, you go to New Orleans, go to other cities, and see the same thing. But the people who are engaged in electoral organizing aren't the people who are out there protesting for the Black Lives Matter. So, I mean, if I had to put my money on where both the troops, the critique, the connections, and the institutional resources are going to come from, I'd say it's got to be the labor movement. I mean, the labor movement's got to be central. Mark, you want to say something on that?
I think that's why politics has degenerated to the point that it has. But I think by framing these issues as broad class issues, you can really begin to build that. I think that's why Medicare for All is such a crucial organizing principle right now. I think the fights for a living wage, the Fight for 15 movement, which responsive movement has redefined what our perception is of what a just and living wage ought to be in this country. And you saw how in every red state where they had an initiative to raise the minimum wage, for example, that initiative passed regardless of whether they also voted for a Republican or a Democrat. So I think there's some broad class organizing principles that we can use to sort of inject into the political dialogue, you know, even with the weakened ability to move things without, you know, a dynamic labor movement that does kind of working class political education work that makes a difference.
We have time for one more question.
Oh, okay, well, it's yours.
How do you feel the issue of immigration fits into the whole scenario that you were discussing?
Well, I mean, look, it's ultimately a bogus issue, right? I mean, in the sense, and it's a bogus issue in most places, right? I mean, like in Eastern Europe, even, things are a little different, because the Italians have taken in a lot of people. But, I mean, it's an issue that arises out of a narrative, right? That some other, some easily, stigmatizable other, is responsible for creating the sense of economic insecurity people have. One of the